Now we'd like to introduce Ed Mango for his keynote. Ed Mango serves as the program manager for the Commercial Crew Program at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The Commercial Crew Program is leading NASA's efforts to develop the United States capability for crew transportation and rescue services to and from the International Space Station and low orbit. The outcome of this capability is expected to stimulate and expand the U.S. space transportation industry. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ed Mango.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, I am Ed Mango. I'm the program manager for the Commercial Crew Program. It's NASA's program that is very much trying to figure out how we're going to get back to low Earth orbit with an American-made system to go do that. So tonight, or this afternoon, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, what we're doing on the NASA side, how we're working closely with our partners, and then after we get through, we're going to have a panel discussion with some of the other folks that are really part of the stakeholder team that's trying to enable the commercial crew effort as a whole nation. So first, you always got to start with a bang, so we're going to do that. So if you really thought that the American space program was at a crossroads, it is, but as you can see, all those pictures and all those videos were of activities that are actually going on, real hardware. None of those were artist renditions or anything like that. That was real hardware from our 3 partners that we're working with under CCICAP. See, the Commercial Crew Program is really leading NASA's effort to develop a U.S. capability that is safe, reliable, and cost-effective to get our astronauts to low Earth orbit, as well as really create a business profile that anybody can get to low Earth orbit using US-made vehicles and US-made systems. And so NASA's helping with that. The whole purpose of this is we don't think industry can do it on their own. Human spaceflight has really been a government program through NASA for the last 50 years. We want to transition that to industry. And part of what we want to do is through this commercial crew program. We have a logo, as you can see from the picture. For those of you that have followed NASA, it looks a whole lot similar to the flight crew emblem that they use. That's because we are going to be flying people. We have red, white, and blue, meaning that it's coming from the United States. If you look closely, the way the flight crew pin is, it's a little different than ours, where if you look at ours closely, it's an orbit. It looks like a C for commercial crew. And of course, we have the same star that they do at the top of theirs, which is we're trying to fly crew into low Earth orbit. All right, so what is the commercial crew program in reference to the big picture? Well, NASA really has an exploration picture that it has put together. And I think there's been some other discussions over the last day or two here about other portions of the exploration mission. From our standpoint, the exploration mission is really broken down into two pieces. That supports low Earth orbit and that supports beyond low Earth orbit. And earlier, I think today you saw or you heard some folks talking about how we're building an architecture to go beyond low Earth orbit. And it's really a capabilities architecture. Let's build the first piece, make that happen. Then we got to figure out how to make the second piece, and then where we're going to go with that piece. And so that's the capabilities architecture-driven capability. For low Earth orbit, it's all about commercial crew, which is really all about space station. It's all really about space station. Space station is an unbelievable $100 billion laboratory in orbit today that is led by the United States, with a significant partner being Russia and 14 other countries that are participating. It is truly international. And we just spent the last 4 or 5 years putting that space station together, actually since 2000, or 1998, I'm sorry, since 1998. So 12 years of putting it together. And we've had people living on board continuously for more than a decade on board the space station. So you think about what do we do today for space? We are flying to space all the time. And we have humans living on a space station for the last 10 years. Not the same ones, but different ones about every 6 months or so. Those folks need a transportation system to get back and forth. The shuttle was the United States way of doing that. When the shuttle was retired, the next system is the commercial crew system. Otherwise, we have to rely on our partners, the Russians, in order to get our crew to space. In order to go do that, we have to give them money, cash, our tax dollars. So the policy of the United States and the policy of NASA is to go develop a home-based system that is made in America for our American crew and any other crew that wants to fly with us. It is a partnership. It's very different than the way NASA has done business before. So as a commercial crew program manager, not only was my mission to be a program manager from the classic NASA way, but also to do it way different. And that's really what my team is trying to do, is do things way different. The normal NASA way, or the normal government way, if you've worked with DoD, is there's a contract, and the contractor does whatever the customer, in this case NASA, commercial crew program, would want them to do. We tell them exactly how to make it, exactly all the requirements, exactly all the specifications, and then they go build it, and they charge you a price to go build it. And in the end, NASA owns the system, NASA owns the design, NASA operates the system. The commercial crew program is done differently. We are doing it in a partnership, in which in the end, we don't own the system, we don't own the design. We collaborate on the design and the system. We have, in the end, we want to buy a service. So today, I don't know how many of you flew in here, but you flew in an airline. And that airline is a service. And it's a service contract, really, between you and the airline to get you from point A to point B. What we want to do in the next generation or two is create the same capability for low Earth orbit. We'll start by going to the International Space Station, but over the next 10 to 20 years, we want to have a capability that says anybody can go to low Earth orbit. Most of them do research, because that's what we're doing on Space Station today. It's all really about the research. research in materials, research in biochemistry. It's all about what you can do in zero gravity or low Earth gravity so that you can bring that capability, bring that knowledge that you gain from space back to Earth, and then go produce medicines, go produce materials that you can use for life here on Earth. The whole space station is all really about life here back on Earth. For the Commercial Crew Program, it's a partnership. And this partnership started back in 2010. And in 2010, we had what was called the Space CCDev-1, or Commercial Crew Development Number 1. And that was initial concepts. And those initial concepts, we had a number of companies join NASA in that endeavor. We then transitioned to CCDev-2, which is now just finishing up, and it was really maturing designs of a system. That is, of a spacecraft or a launch vehicle. And now we're in what we call CCICAP. NASA loves acronyms, so we have more. The Commercial Crew Integrated Capability. And I purposely put the little I in there, because I get to do that as a program manager, because most of us have iPhones, and most of us have iPads, or a lot of us might have iPads. And it changed the entire way we look at getting on the web, the way we look at communicating with our friends, the way we look at communicating within business. They translated the way we do knowledge, information sharing. And so, in my mind, what we're doing today is an integrated capability, and we're trying to change the way the world, the way the United States, is going to focus on low Earth orbit. So that's why we added the little I. We now are beginning to transition, as the ICAP activity goes for the next 2 years, we're going to transition to a certification, because in the end, you have to be certified. Today, when you fly your airplane, the FAA certifies you. And the panel we'll have in a little while, we'll talk a little bit more about our relationship with the FAA. Today, we're going to certify it, NASA's going to certify it for our mission to get our crew to the International Space Station. But the goal over time is for the FAA to be the regulatory certification activity so that whatever vehicle is made will go in orbit just like you make an airplane and just like you fly an airplane from point A to point B. We want to have the FAA be part of that process for low Earth orbit. That's the long-term goal, and we're making our steps to go make that happen as we move forward. And eventually we get into services. So eventually, I always like to say, NASA's going to buy a ticket to ride. We're going to go buy a ticket to get our crew from the planet surface up to the ISS and then back down safely. This picture here shows that our initial concept, which was CCDev-1, was about $50 million of government investment. The interesting part about all three of the phases that we've done so far is that not all of it is paid for by taxpayer dollars. That $50 million was matched to some level by our partners. When we did CCDev-2, the government, or NASA, spent $315 million. Quite a big increase, seven-fold increase from where we were in CCDev-1. But again, we, the government, did not pay 100% of the dollar that had to be done. In fact, the way we're doing business in this partnership is we bring money to the table, they bring money to the table. Now, space development is not a couple $1 million. It's hundreds of millions of dollars, in fact, a couple $1 billion. So we know companies don't have a couple $1 billion sitting in cash to go try to compete to win a contract for services with a seat price of roughly $60–70 million. They need help from the government, which is why the government then invests in this activity. It also creates the industry. You know, the whole reason we have airlines today is because of folks that thought airmail was important to be from the government side, and over time we said, you know, really commercial industry can do airmail. And we turned it over to commercial industry, and that budded the idea of moving mail from point A to point B in the United States in the 1920s. A couple of those airlines, or a couple of those carriers that carry mail said, you know, we could put seats in this thing and carry people. And then Charles Lindbergh decided on his own, unbelievable courage in that guy, to say, I'm going to fly across the ocean and prove that an airplane can do it nonstop. And he did it in 1927. Those two events created the airline industry we have today. So there's many times I talk about Lindbergh moments in the space program, and the shuttle had many Lindbergh moments in the space program, such as the Hubble Space Telescope repair, building the International Space Station. And I think you just heard a speech a little while ago about Mir. Imagine what we did when we went to Mir with the shuttle program to begin with, and now on the International Space Station. It's about cooperation, because coming off the planet, I think Mr. Cabana talked yesterday, when you're off the planet looking at the surface, you really can't see borders or barriers between countries. It's all Earth. And so it's good to do things internationally. It's also good to have a leader in an international activity, and that we always want to have be the United States. What we're under now is CC-ICAP, and ICAP is $1.1 billion worth of milestone awards that we've given out. The other way that we're working business is, again, in a contract, you count the number of people that are working, how much they make, and that's the check that they get from the government every month, every year, whatever the case is. That's called a cost plus kind of contract, and there's a whole discussion about contracts. What we're doing is pay for performance milestones. We set up criteria for milestones. When a company makes the milestone and makes that criteria successful, and they show NASA that they have done that, then it's stewards of the taxpayer money. We look at that criteria and then we pay them for that milestone. So they can have 5 people working it, or they can have 50,000 people working it. What we pay for is the completion of that milestone. And so it's a different way of doing business and has been quite successful in our development so far. Let me talk about the 3 companies. The first is Boeing. So Boeing has been around doing human space flight since Mercury. Some of the companies that make up Boeing. Oops. Go back to that one. Boeing has been around since the Mercury days. They helped make the capsule for Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. They did the space shuttle, or the companies that they work with did those vehicles. So they have the history of human space flight. What they're trying to do is they're going to be flying off an Atlas V rocket, and again, on the panel that we'll have in a little bit, you'll hear some folks from ULA talk about how the rockets that we have flown for many years and what we fly today with commercial satellites and DoD satellites can also be used for flying people, and that's what the Atlas V is all about. Boeing they have what they call a CTS 100. And what they're trying to do is not invent new technologies. They're trying to package the stuff that has worked for the last 50 years into smarter, simpler, more cost-effective methods in order to put it into a package and fly it that way. So when you look at the CTS 100, you say, well, gee, we've already flown Apollo, and maybe that looks like an Apollo capsule. It might look like an Apollo capsule, and those that are aerospace engineers will tell you that that design is actually what you want to fly if you're going to fly a capsule kind of environment. But the insides are totally different than anything according to what Apollo had. It also lands on land. And of course, Apollo was not intended to land on land. And so they're doing an awful lot of work in order to get their design down, and that's their focus, is to repackage systems in order to make them more cost effective and more efficient so they can bring the price down for a particular mission. They're doing very well. They think that they can fly between 2016 and 2017. In fact, the goal of the Commercial Crew Program is to have services around the middle of 2017. So all these companies are in the process of doing their detailed design work today, getting to a critical design by the middle of 2014, lots of engineering talent that has to go into all the work in the next 2 years. And then we'll begin certification efforts with at least one, if not more than one company, in order to get them to a certified state so they can fly our crew. The second company is Sierra Nevada. Sierra Nevada has really been a partnership with NASA for many, many years. In fact, their design is based on what is referred to as the HL-20 that was really developed by Langley a number of years ago. Langley got the design for the HL-20 and its concept of a lifting body from something that the Russians were flying in the 1980s, or trying to fly in the 1980s. So you can see that the environment for aerospace and the movement of aerospace forward is really an international effort, whether you do it as adversaries or you do it as friends. Probably better to do it as friends. Sierra Nevada's system is also going to be flown off of an Atlas V rocket. They have, like I said, a lifting body, so it can land on a runway. That is one of their claims to fame, is that they would like to land on a runway, much like shuttle. So it looks a little bit like shuttle, but it's only about a quarter the size. It holds up to 7 people, or 4 people, plus a number of the experiments that we want those folks to go up and do experiments on and then come back. So it holds their experiments as well. It uses hybrid motors, which is that picture on the, I guess, lower right. That's a hybrid motor, which is their abort engines. Very good technology. It's also used on Spaceship One, or Spaceship Two now. It's used on Spaceship Two. It's the same company that makes that same motor for both Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser as well as for Spaceship Two. They also believe that they can fly probably around late 2016, 2017 timeframe. So that's our second partner. Our third partner is SpaceX. Now, SpaceX, like Sierra Nevada, is a privately owned company. SpaceX and their owner really has a dream. And his dream is to go create a commercial system that can carry cargo, people, and eventually figure out how to have a commercial system that can go to Mars. That's pretty cool. Now, Mars is also many decades away. And it probably won't be by a commercial system to begin with because of the technology needed. However, SpaceX is already flying cargo. They were given a system to develop with NASA called COTS a number of years ago, in which they developed a cargo system that now has flown a couple times to the space station, once on its services mission. So at the beginning you saw that circle that we had, or called the Circle of Life. That circle that says, here's the different phases of a program. Well, for COTS, they've already completed that circle totally, and they're now in the services for SpaceX. And SpaceX has been quite successful. Now, you can say, well, SpaceX has had some failures, they've had some growing pains. Well, every vehicle that ever flies, every system that flies, never flies perfect. We are humans. It's humans that are building the system. And so there's mistakes that are made. There's engines that don't fire exactly right. There's orbital problems when it gets near the space station that have to be redone. The good news is that when you have humans in the loop, you can overcome those problems. You can figure out the root cause of those kind of systems, those kind of problems, and move on. And SpaceX is experiencing that today in their cargo system. What they want to do is take that cargo system and their Falcon 9 rocket and basically evolve it to hold people. So just like the airmail system that had airplanes, that moved airmail from point A to point B, and some of those airlines, like TWA back then, said, you know, maybe we should pick seats in this airplane and carry people. That is exactly what Elon is thinking about space. And he's doing quite well with it as time goes on. So that's our third company. Now you can say, well, I have 3 companies. You can say, is SpaceX the winner? Is Boeing the winner? Because it's competition. It's all about competition. NASA, which represents the U.S. government, which represents you all as taxpayers, or when you all pay taxes after college, you got to think about the fact that we want to reduce the amount of money we want to put into these systems. So competition is how you do that. If you look at competition from the idea of an iPad, a Nook, and a Kindle Fire, now we see huge competition. It was all iPad at one point. Now you have Kindle Fires that are just as popular, if not more popular, as iPads. And because of the Kindle Fire, iPad, or Apple, has gone back and made a mini iPad to compete against the Kindle Fire. It's all about competition. So with these 3 companies, really looking at things differently, but trying to get to the same destination, humans into low Earth orbit. That competition will keep our development costs lower, development costs that we all have to contribute to, and keep our services price much lower. Because if the development is higher, if you all take any business classes, sooner or later you got to get your rate of return based on how much you put into the development, which is another reason why NASA and the taxpayers need to help in this development, because we don't have a rate of return that says we need to have an investment and we get 20% back or 10% back. Our investment, our rate of return is that we have a system that can go fly our crew to the International Space Station and create an industry that can go do business in low Earth orbit. And why do business in low Earth orbit? Again, it's all about research. It's all about what you can do back here on Earth. And as soon as we find out that we can do research like they're doing at the International Space Station today on some of the biomedical activities that they're doing on Space Station to look for vaccines for things like MRSA, and I'm not a doctor, I have no clue what all that is. But I would tell you, the Commercial Crew Program is a transportation system to go make that happen in order to go get access to the laboratories. And once we start doing that, there'll be more laboratories in space. Once you start understanding how we can use these vehicles to go repair satellites, to go service satellites, the industry will come even bigger. It's all about starting the industry so the industry can grow. That's what NASA is all about in the Commercial Crew Program, and that's what we're trying to help our partners with. What does NASA bring to the table? Well, NASA doesn't just bring money. We do bring a lot of money. Again, CCI cap is about 1.1 billion. We believe it costs about $3 to $4 billion to get a particular company to finish. So if we spent $1 or $2 billion or $1.5 billion so far, you can think that we've got to spend another $1.5 to $2 billion in order to get a particular partner all the way through completion. That's a lot of dollars. The other thing NASA brings to the table is our experience. We have 50 years of human spaceflight experience, 135 shuttle flights, a space station that's operating today. All is good. Perfect, and that's what we want to go help them. That's what we want to go help these companies with. But at the same point, these companies are extremely innovative. When you have competition, innovation goes sky high. So again, look at Apple and Nook and those other guys. Innovation goes sky high and price comes down. NASA is very good at innovation for things that no one has ever done before. We want these companies to be innovative in how to get the price down, how to get the efficiency up, and how to be innovative in order to get to low Earth orbit. So that's what we bring to the table, is our 50 years of some hard lessons, and also our ability to go and give them the knowledge that we have about how to go build spaceships, how to go deal with radiation in space, how to deal with wastewater in space, how to deal with guidance, navigation, control, how to deal with micrometeorites, micrometeorite damage that we've seen in the past, and how do you go control that on a vehicle that you're going to get a random hit sooner or later, and so how do you control it at that point? Those are the kind of things that NASA brings to the table besides our funding. Like I talked about Lindbergh, this entire commercial crew effort, and in fact most of what NASA does, is really all about trying to recreate Lindbergh moments. And I believe by 2016 or so, we will have a couple more Lindbergh moments. And Lindbergh was a citizen. He did not work for the government. He actually financed most of his trip all by himself and with help from others, but certainly on his own. And that's what we're trying to do here. We want to go create Lindbergh moments in which now we have access to low Earth orbit by a system that is owned and operated by a company. That is what we're trying to do. You know, I've been with NASA for many years. Really, I've worked on the space shuttle program since 1981. So I'm at the other end of my career. The folks who are really going to go make this happen is you all. It's you all as you graduate next year or the year after from college. Those who are getting their masters, once you get your masters and you want to get into industry, you're the ones who are going to go make this happen. Because by that point, I'm going to want to go retire. And so, so think about the innovation that you can bring to the table. Think about what you as an individual and you as a group of people can bring to the table in order to go make capability to low Earth orbit, science in low Earth orbit, and even beyond low Earth orbit. How can you all help NASA, help the country go do that? NASA is an agent of the country. We implement space policy. Space policy is made by all the people in Washington, D.C. We as engineers, we as people who like technology and want to work in technology are there to help implement that policy. And so I encourage you all to think about how you want to go help. How do you want to go make these dreams come true? This last picture does have this guy who helped with the Mars mission that landed on Mars a couple months ago. Unbelievable mission. And that was really innovation. How do you go land something as size as a Mini Cooper on Mars and have it operate within hours after it landed? Unbelievable technology, unbelievable dreaming of how to go do something. Anybody can have a dream. The best part about being an engineer is then you make those dreams a reality. And I encourage you all to make your dreams a reality. That's all I had, unless there's questions. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to invite our panel to please come forward. All right, I'd like to introduce our panel. Ed Mango just spoke about the commercial program, and we're going to have Les Kovacs come up and do something very similar in a little bit here. Les is the Director of Executive Branch Affairs in Washington, D.C. for United Launch Alliance, headquartered in Denver, Colorado. In his role, Les is responsible for leading ULA's interface with the White House, NASA, Department of Commerce and Defense, and the Air Force, and shaping policies that affect ULA's business in general and the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program in specific. The EELV program launches the nation's most valuable national security and scientific payloads to Earth orbit and interplanetary destinations. We also have Dr. Alexander Saltman. He serves as the Executive Director of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. Prior to joining the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, Saltman most recently served as the Legislative Director for Congressman Adam Schiff, who represents an area of Southern California that includes NASA's JPL, and who, as a member of the House Appropriations Committee, has been a leading figure in space policy and NASA appropriation issues. And finally, on our panel, we also have Dr. George C. Neal, who serves as the Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA. He has over 30 years of aerospace experience with the Air Force, at NASA, and in private industry. Dr. Neal came to the FAA from the Orbital Sciences Corporation, where he served as Senior Scientist for the Advanced Programs Group. And so I think with that, we'll hand it over to Mr. Kovacs.
All right, thank you for having me. Pretty distinguished panel. I promised Andrew that I would I'd warp through these slides because he told me you've got 10 minutes, don't make me come up there and get you. So, all right, so Ed just told you about the program. United Launch Alliance is one of the companies supporting 2 of the 3 folks that are going to be launching payloads in the human launch services category. So we actually directly support CST-100 for Boeing, and we support Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser space plane. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about NASA's vision for exploration, how we fit into that vision, and then, all right, then we're going to talk about ULA's launch vehicles, how they fit into the big scheme of things, how we're going to help NASA meet that vision. We're then going to talk about how we participate in the human launch services, and then things we're doing with respect to our launch vehicles and the infrastructure to get ready to support these human launch services. And then we're going to take a look at exploration flight test number one of the very first missions we're going to conduct to support the HLS effort. And then we're going to take a look at the schedule on how this is all being driven. And then lastly, I'll show you about a 2-minute video of all the launches that ULA has conducted this year because everybody likes to see smoke and fire. All right, so this is NASA's vision for exploration. If you look at this chart, you're at the bottom left right now, which is why I envy all of you out there in the audience. You guys are going to be the ones that are going to be executing boxes 2 through 5 on this chart. One of the things that NASA has done that's extremely smart is they're staying away from trying to talk about a single destination. You don't hear anybody inside the Beltway saying things like, well, we're going to go to Mars. No, right now what we're doing is we're demonstrating the technologies required to lay the foundation for those types of complex missions in the out years. As soon as you say you're going to go to Mars, it becomes a very easy thing for Congress to look at that as a cash cow, a big ticket item, and you can whack that pretty easily. If you lay out a series of technologies that you want to advance, that's a much more easier thing to defend. So that's what NASA's doing here in the bottom left. We're focusing efforts on near-Earth orbit, low-Earth orbit things, and then incrementally moving out through the solar system to the moon, L1, other destinations, and ultimately beyond the solar system. All right, so these are the launch vehicles that United Launch Alliance has that are going to support this effort. On the far left is Delta II. It can launch about a 4,200-pound payload to low Earth orbit, which equates to a car. And then as you move left to right, you ultimately get to the Delta IV Heavy, which can launch about 29,000 pounds, roughly a school bus, into low Earth orbit. Don't ask me why we picked an elephant to represent the medium class vehicle. It should have been something like a UPS van. So this is how we're going to actually participate. Ed talked to you about the 2 launches in the middle. Those are Dream Chaser and CST-100. On the far left is that exploration flight test. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. That's scheduled for 2014. And then in 2017, the SLS system comes up online. That's on the far right. And we're also supporting that by developing an upper stage for NASA. All right, so this is that upper stage for NASA. It is called the interim cryo propulsion stage. It will be supplemented by things like an emergency detection system that I'm going to talk to you about. There's also a common avionics system there that NASA can take advantage of if they want to do that. But essentially, this is what we're going to do. It'll support launches in 2017 and 2021 for crewed activity. It's a very capable and proven upper stage. All right, so the commercial crew highlights, right now we're sitting there at CCICAP. These are the things that we've already accomplished. So if you look at the bottom of this chart, you'll see 3 things. One is the avionics on the left-hand side. The center is the dual-engine Centaur. And then we're also doing infrastructure upgrades to the launch pads to enable all of this. All right, so why do we think that we're pretty exceptional at this? Well, because we've launched about 60, well, we have launched 60 rockets. United Launch Alliance, since it was formed in 2006, we've launched 60 vehicles. We have not had a single failure. If you wanted to put your kids and grandkids on a rocket, you would fly them on an Atlas V. That rocket is probably the best launch vehicle in the world, which is why 2 of these competitors have picked us to launch their payloads. We also have a flight heritage that includes some interplanetary deep space exploration missions where we've demonstrated pretty complex capabilities, one of which is things like launching payloads that are powered by nuclear power sources. We have NASA Category 3 certification, which is the most stringent certification out there. We are entrusted with the nation's most valuable payloads. We launch all of the nation's spy satellites. We launch all of the Air Force's global positioning system satellites, communications satellites, navigation satellites, weather satellites, a whole host of things for NASA and civil partners also. So the emergency detection system is one of the things we're doing. When you're flying on a rocket, and you're sitting on the nose, and something starts going wrong, you want to know that the escape system can get you off of that rocket. The Atlas V is very reliable and a very capable vehicle. However, it does not have the sensors and instrumentation yet for an emergency escape system. So what we're doing is we are actually fitting the engine with additional sensors. So when something goes wrong, like an engine starts blowing up, or turbo pump starts spinning out of control, or you have a catastrophic loss of pressure, sensors will send that indication to the emergency detection system in the nose of the rocket, and it will separate the capsule or the space plane from the exploding rocket and get it far enough away to survive the overpressure or the resulting fireball. So that's one of the things we're doing. One of the other things we're doing is to get more capability to low Earth orbit. We're developing a dual engine Centaur. This will also augment the Atlas capabilities. And then we're also doing infrastructure upgrades. These are things that we're doing to the launch pad. You may think that the ground stuff, for those of you that are civil engineers, structural engineering, there's a lot of work here. A lot of the glory goes to things like performance engineering, aerodynamics, those kinds of things, structural engineering on the launch vehicle itself. The ground system, and Ed Mango can tell you this better than I can, it is as equally complex as the launch vehicle is, if not more so. It is a difficult thing to fuel and launch a rocket. That is not an easy thing. The guys sitting on the nose of a rocket get all the glory because they're the astronauts, but the ground team makes all of this happen. So things like moving work platforms on mobile service towers to access emergency escape systems so a crew can depart, in this case, the space plane, and get safely away from the launch pad if you had a catastrophic accident on the pad. Those are all things that we're doing. So lots of engineering behind that, explosive arc analysis, stuff like that, structural analysis, things like the slide wires, all things to ensure astronaut safety. This is the schedule we're working to. Right now we're sitting in the CCI cap base phase. That should end sometime in 2014. All of the things I talked about that we're doing, those are listed there in the text to the right of that box. And then at the bottom you'll see NASA certification, so that'll also start in 2013. And that will ultimately lead to something known as EFT-1, Exploration Flight Test 1. We're basically going to launch a capsule out to about 3,700 mile altitude. It's going to come screaming back in at about 20,000 miles per hour. It's going to demonstrate the heating of the aeroshell, the heat shield. So there's Launch Complex 37. So we're talking about modifying these service towers that you see here. There's also a crew access arm right here. Doing all sorts of modifications to those launch pads to be able to do that. Adding umbilicals that weren't there before. They have to be at a specific level to access the rocket. All of this stuff is being done on a non-interference basis with all of the launches that are ongoing. So we have a pretty full manifest launching stuff for the national security market. We're building all of this stuff in place between launches. And then the last slide here is, these are all of the things we're doing for launch site modifications. I just went over these. These are all of the umbilical arm safety features we're adding to the launch pad and all the fixed infrastructure like the crew access and escape systems. All right, so now I've got about a 2-minute video to show you all the launches that we've conducted over the last year. Just to prove to you that we can really do it.
Liftoff of the United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket carrying the first mobile user objective system mission for the United States Navy.
Ignition, 1, 0, and liftoff of the United Launch Alliance Delta IV rocket carrying the NLO 1225 mission for the National Reconnaissance Office. Atlas engine ignition, 0, and liftoff of the United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket carrying AEHF-2 for the United States Air Force. And the RD-180 engine roars to life. And liftoff of the Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket carrying the NRO L-38 payload for the National Reconnaissance Office. And the RS-68A engines roar to life and liftoff of the United Launch Alliance Delta IV Heavy carrying the NRO L-15 mission for the National Reconnaissance Office.
Off the Atlas V rocket and twin spacecraft on a mission to unlock the mysteries of Earth's Van Allen belts.
Atlas engine ignition, 1, 0, and liftoff for the United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket L-36 for the National Reconnaissance Office.
We have ignition of the RS-68 main engine to 1, 0, liftoff of the United Launch Alliance Delta IV rocket carrying the GPS-2F3 satellite for the United States Air Force.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm George Neild, and I'm pleased to be here today. I think Ed and Les did a great job of describing a little bit about the Commercial Crew Program. I'd like to take a look at things from a little bit different perspective, and I'd like to start off my remarks with a prediction. Sometime in the next 10 years or so, we're going to wake up one morning and open up the Washington Post, New York Times, or whatever website we use to keep track of the news on our iPad or smartphones, and all of a sudden, we're going to be feeling stunned and heartbroken and confused and a variety of other very powerful emotions. Because the headlines are going to say something along the lines of, "Lost in space. Astronauts perish during routine trip to space station. Program on hold as engineers scramble to determine likely cause." Now believe me, I'm not looking forward to that happening, but I think it is extremely likely. Now why do I say that? Because space transportation, like all other modes of transportation, involves risk. In 2009, the most recent year for which data is available, 547 people lost their lives in aviation accidents, most of which involved general aviation aircraft. Accidents related to trains and railroad systems killed 695 people. Recreational boating claimed the lives of 736 participants. And on our nation's highways, we experienced 33,868 fatalities involving cars, trucks, buses, and motorcycles. So I don't think it's very realistic to assume that those of us in the space transportation business will be able to eliminate accidents completely, no matter how much emphasis we place upon safety and mission assurance. So what's going to happen after that accident occurs? Well, if we assume that it involves a space vehicle that is owned by the federal government, or if it's being used pursuant to a contract with the federal government, then according to Public Law 109-155, the NASA Authorization Act of 2005, the President will be required to establish an independent, nonpartisan commission to investigate the accident, determine the cause, identify all of the contributing factors, and make recommendations for corrective actions. Sounds good, right? Well, maybe, or maybe not. Our experience with the last two commissions that were called upon to investigate the Challenger and Columbia accidents was that the shuttle ended up being grounded for about 2.5 years in each case before NASA was allowed to resume operations. Could we have identified and fixed the problems in less time if we hadn't had those commissions and all of the extra scrutiny that they entailed? Well, it's hard to know for sure, but I think we probably could have. Given the current structure of the Commercial Crew Program, under which private industry is being called upon to develop systems to take our nation's astronauts to and from the International Space Station, there's a lot of debate about whether industry is capable of building vehicles that are safe enough to transport NASA astronauts. Certainly, NASA has a tremendous amount of expertise and experience, with more than 50 years of practice in sending people into space. Unfortunately, the government safety record isn't all that great. As you know, during the 135 missions of the Space Shuttle, we had 2 fatal accidents, resulting in the loss of 14 crew members. Perhaps even more important, though, is the rather limited progress that we have made in opening up space to the business community, to the general public. In the 50 years since Alan Shepard became the first American in space, we've had some very impressive accomplishments. The Apollo moon landings, the launch and repair of the Hubble Space Telescope, construction and operation of the International Space Station among them. But only just over 500 people worldwide have had the opportunity to personally experience spaceflight. Now, 50 years after the Wright brothers first took to the air, we had seen barnstormers putting on air shows, giving rides to interested onlookers. The airmail system had become a reality. Charles Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic, and air transportation had become widely available to the general public. In fact, by 1953, there were over 6,000 airports in the US, 88,000 civil aircraft, over 500,000 licensed pilots, and more than 24 million revenue passengers taken to the air every year. Suppose instead that, starting with the Wright brothers, every aircraft had been designed strictly in accordance with government specifications. Every aircraft had been built under a cost-plus government contract. Every pilot and co-pilot had been a government employee. Every airplane flight had been primarily in support of a government mission. And every passenger had been specially selected and trained by the federal government. Do you think there's any possibility that aviation would look like it does today? I sure don't. That's why I am so excited about NASA's Commercial Crew Program. It offers an opportunity to take advantage of the innovation and creativity of American industry in a way that has the potential to be mutually beneficial for both the companies involved and for the government. In fact, if it can achieve its stated goals of the development of safe, reliable, and cost-effective transportation to low Earth orbit, it could enable a significant increase in the opportunity that the general public has to get into space themselves. So those of us at the FAA are working very hard with our NASA partners to try and make this program successful. Last June, NASA and the FAA signed an agreement spelling out how we plan to cooperate on commercial human space flights to the International Space Station. Companies will be required to get an FAA license for those operations to ensure public safety, while NASA will retain responsibility for the safety of its astronauts and for mission assurance. So what do you think will happen if there is an accident, either as part of the Commercial Crew Program or perhaps during one of the flights of the Space Launch System in Orion? Is it mandatory that we have a 2.5 years stand down while we undertake a thorough search for someone to hold responsible for the tragedy? And while we identify all of the changes we need to make so that we can guarantee that we will never have an accident again? I don't think it has to be that way. In fact, I'd like to offer 5 recommendations for your consideration that are intended to help us be more tolerant of the accidents that do occur and that may allow us to find a problem, fix it, and get back to flying as soon as we can. First, we need to do away with the requirement for a presidential commission following accidents that occur during flights conducted under government contract. Although well-intentioned, such a requirement is not only not helpful, it is counterproductive. The threat of a congressional hearing and/or extra help from elected officials looking over the shoulders of our technical experts is likely to discourage the use of non-traditional design features or operational approaches, even if those are the kinds of things we need to be looking at to achieve significantly improved levels of safety and reliability. Second, we need to do a better job of helping our senior political leadership, the news media, and the general public to understand the risks involved in launching rockets. As Congress itself pointed out in the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004, spaceflight is inherently risky. It should not be a shock when things occasionally go wrong, or when new technologies do not always perform in the expected way. Third, those of us, both in government and in industry, have to be more willing to share information about accidents, incidents, close calls, and lessons learned. The tendency we all have is not to talk about the problems we encounter because it can be embarrassing, or it might give an advantage to a competitor because of the release of what might have been proprietary data. But if we're not willing to share information within the industry, each company is going to have to end up having to learn those lessons the hard way, with lives potentially being lost needlessly by making the same mistakes over and over again, company by company. That's not the way for our industry to grow and mature. Fourth, we need to be open to new technologies and new ways of doing business. If instead, we insist on continuing to use the same design approaches and the same operational techniques that we have always used in the past, then we shouldn't be surprised if we end up continuing to have the same kind of safety record that we have always had in the past, with a fatal accident rate of about 1 in every 100 launches. What we need to be doing is to strive for an accident rate that's about 10,000 times better than that, more like the one we currently have with scheduled airliners, with about 1 fatal accident for every 1,000,000 flights. One great way to do that would be through support for our Center of Excellence for Commercial Space Transportation, which involves students and professors from 9 different universities around the country working on problems that are of interest to both government and to industry. And finally, the government needs to do all we can to enable the development of multiple independent systems capable of taking people to low Earth orbit. Competition not only helps to keep costs down, but in the event of an accident or a complex problem that is uncovered during pre-launch testing, rather than waiting out a lengthy grounding, like we did with the shuttle, we can just use a different rocket or a different spacecraft to get our astronauts back and forth to orbit. So those are some of my thoughts on commercial crew from an FAA perspective. Spaceflight will never be truly routine, but the more we can encourage regular and frequent launches, and the more tolerant we can be of the inevitable problems that we will encounter, the more we're going to learn, and the more rapidly we're going to be able to achieve safe, reliable, and cost-effective space transportation. I look forward to your questions.
Hi, it may be rather apparent, but I'm rather sick, so my voice may go out in the middle of this. I may or may not notice, so let me know if I don't notice. I have a, with Dr. Neal talking about safety and in the end, the possible death of people flying on spaceships, I'm up here to talk a little bit about the Commercial Spaceflight Federation and then also about the other certainty we have in life, which is gridlock in Congress. So, the Commercial Spaceflight Federation is a trade group for commercial spaceflight companies. That is, we have about 45 companies. Here are 15 of them who are executive members, and we represent them in DC. We lobby, we work with NASA, we develop consensus standards. We do all the things that make an industry as a whole can do better than any company can alone. Here are some of our associate members. Many people from some of these companies have been here today. Of course, ULA is one of our members on this panel. And we also have research and education affiliates. And if you're interested in that, just let me know. I promise not to get too close to you, but I will give you my card. And we can talk about what it takes to make your school a research and education affiliate. This is rather this screen here flashes on and off, so I have to kind of look to what's going on there. So I want to very briefly talk about a fundamental question here, which is, why are we interested in doing things in a commercial fashion? And in fact, it's not totally clear that commercial is exactly the right word to use for the Commercial Crew Program. But it is the word we came up with several years ago, and now everybody knows what it means. So I don't think we're changing anytime soon. So there are a few characteristics that make it different. One is that it's a staged competition. That is to say that there is a competition during development to create the capabilities that will then receive contracts, competitively bid contracts in the end. This has worked very well with the Commercial Cargo Program. One of the biggest successes of the Commercial Cargo Program is that one of the companies failed. One of the first companies that was given a contract was Rocket Plane Kistler. They did not reach one of their early milestones. NASA paid for them for the milestones they had reached and then terminated the contract and brought in Orbital to fill in instead. And that is the type of development that couldn't have happened in a different kind of contract, or it would have been much more difficult at least. The second thing is that it's a new kind of development relationship between the companies and NASA. This is not, this seems like this is like a question of industrial organization. Right? It seems like a boring question, but in fact it's quite important because it means that the incentives of the contractors and of NASA are better aligned and are better directed towards the goal that we want in the end, which is a safe, reliable, inexpensive system. Third, an expectation of multiple customers. Now, this is an expectation, it's not a sure thing, but we know that there are markets out there for launch vehicles. In fact, if you don't talk about the crew side, and if you just say, are there multiple customers for the launch vehicles? Well, there already are. The Atlas V launches about 10 times a year, sometimes a bit more. And so the fixed costs of maintaining that system are already spread over those 10 launches. And if you add another couple for Commercial Crew, you don't add much more cost. And then the fourth is what I like to call commoditization. And I don't want you to take that too seriously. But the idea is that, we don't want to have a system that you have to rebuild anew each time you fly. And partly that is reusability. If it's not reusable, then obviously you, in some sense, indeed have to build it again. But if you're building things on an assembly line, if you're doing things for large volumes, then the fixed costs get spread out over a lot of launches, and you you get the kind of regularity and that you'd like to have. And that is also an important part of this thing. NASA is no longer buying a service where they say, okay, you do that, and they come back to you every few days and say, okay, now you do that. Instead, they're saying, this is what we want. Go do it. And then they'll buy it from you. Okay, sorry, I need to move faster here, I think. So, in the end, what we'll get from this is reduced cost. Maybe you can see this, yes. Reduced cost, diversification of capability, as Dr. Young was saying. NASA allowed to focus on its core mission, the revitalization of an industry, and hopefully the creation of a new one or two. We also get a diversification of goals. We get companies who have very, very interesting and significant goals of their own, whose interests line up with NASA and who can work with NASA for a while. So I'm going to go through this a little bit briefly. Excuse me a second. One of my jobs is working with Congress, and so I look at this, the commercial program, and when I think about the commercial program, I think about the companies launching rockets and the folks at NASA making it all work. But I also think about the coalitions in Congress that were required to make it happen. Hold on. So this is the, this slide is just the sort of history of the actual events that occurred in the development of commercial cargo and crew. However, and it looks relatively regular. You know, there's cargo services, and then a couple years later, there's crew services, and CRS contracts are awarded, and there's awards every year or so. And this hides a rather difficult decision-making process that was going on in Congress throughout this period. So the commercial cargo program, which started in about 2006, depending on how you count, was relatively non-controversial. It wasn't an enormous project. We were already getting cargo services to the space station from the Japanese and the Europeans, or we had expectation that we would. It went, the early years of that went mostly unnoticed in Congress. And then there were some successes and a few delays. And the first time this all became quite controversial, I think, was in 2009, or 2010, I guess it was. No, 2009 was the first time when NASA wanted to use about $200 million of stimulus money, as money from the our American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, to start the commercial crew program, to issue the first contracts. And in the end, only 50 of that was provided by Congress because there were opponents in Congress who didn't want to give it up. And that's a theme that you'll see repeated. So here are a few more of things that happened. This is a little bit into the weeds. The president released his budget request in 2011, which really put NASA on a different track. Over that year, NASA, the administration, and Congress came together and came up with a compromise that did some of what the president wanted to do and retained some capabilities as well that other folks wanted. One of the things the president wanted to do was the commercial crew program. And so for the last 2 years or so, and you can see here, the president has requested about $850 million this time for the program, and the Congress has given first 312, then 406, and now 500 or 525, assuming nothing bad happens between now and then. It has been in some ways it seems like the president keeps pushing and Congress keeps saying no, but you'll notice that Congress keeps saying no less and less each time. The amount is going up. And this is at a time when overall spending and spending on the NASA budget is going down. It is very difficult to start a government program in those circumstances. And this is actually quite a good success to get that kind of growth. That said, we will need to start getting more funds very soon now. So then I'll just say a little bit about the threats for the future and expectations for the future. So in the end, I'll go to the last one first. In the end, all this depends on technical progress from the companies, and they're making some great progress, and it's really exciting to see the testing that they're doing with real equipment and real hardware. And for somebody like me who works in DC, background in science, but who now works in DC, it's great to be able to be sort of the running interference for the guys out there getting their hands dirty, guys and gals out there getting their hands dirty. But there are many questions about what will come in the future funding. We don't know what the president will request. Ed? I guess he probably doesn't quite know yet either. We don't know what the funding levels for the government overall will be. We don't know what NASA's overall funding level will be. We don't know if sequestration will hit at the end of this year, which means that all government programs will be cut by about 10%, 8 to 10%. That would obviously be bad for everybody, including the Commercial Crew Program. And we don't know if there will continue to be differences between the administration and Congress. Over the last 2 years, when the administration first proposed the Commercial Crew Program, there was a lot of wailing and rending of garments in Congress. And over the last 2 years, the administration has made their case quite well to Congress that this is a very important and necessary capability. And there are still some people who are not convinced, but there are many, many more, I think, at this point who are. And at this point, it's just a question of finding the money to make it happen. It's relatively optimistic. The program's in good shape, but we're in a tough time overall, and a lot of things can happen here. This is my contact information. If you have any questions about some of the other stuff CSF does, this is some portion of our portfolio. Come up to me afterwards, and don't get too close, but that'll all be good.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes here. We have time for some questions if you guys have anything you'd like to inquire.
Ask a question.
Sure, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, maybe you guys speak a little bit more about like the crew. Is that going to be? Are these? Obviously, the crew's going to be provided by like ULA and things like that as well, right? Or is it also going to be astronauts?
So Ed's the ultimate spokesperson for all this, but the purpose of the services is to take NASA astronauts or others that the U.S. is sponsoring to and from the space station. Now, as we get to the point where NASA is happy that certification requirements have been met, there may be test flights that would be conducted with company personnel involved, and all of those details have not yet been worked out, but I think that is certainly a feasible possibility.
Yeah, the NASA requirements are for 4 NASA or NASA-sponsored crew to get to the space station. All the vehicles that we talked about today all have capability of more than 4 people. How they operate their vehicle, whether or not the NASA folks are going along for the ride to get to the space station, which is their destination, or they're part of the piloting of the vehicle, is still to be determined. I think as Dr. Neal suggested, during the time of testing, I would expect in fact, the way we're trying to set up the program is that it would be very similar to how you go do a military aircraft development system, in which you have test pilots or folks that are doing testing that are from the company as well as from NASA, and they combine to create a joint task force. And depending on the expertise of the individual pilot or the expertise of what we're trying to certify at that moment. Those are the folks that might be flying that particular vehicle. So between now and 2016, I would see a mixed crew of contractor personnel, just like when you buy an F-18, and also government people, NASA people. I think it'd be a joint effort until we need services. And then depending on how the vehicle is flown, whether or not it's flown by a company pilot and the NASA folks are there for the service, or the NASA astronauts are also there to pilot the vehicle, I think is to be determined. And it's still open trade space, part of that innovation effort.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Does anybody else?
One more question. I can't see you guys up here. You might like to speak up.
Hello, my name is Stu. I'm from Iowa State, and this question is for Ed. My question is, what is the future for the commercial crew program? As in, once low Earth orbit is developed, is the program going to be extended to, say, like Mars, if humans ever go there?
Good question. I'd ask Alex also to say something about this. You know, the reason why the commercial crew program and NASA's pursuing that is because the technology to do low Earth orbit capability is already there. It's a matter of innovating the technology that's there or repackaging it, like I've described. And so you can give that over to industry and let them go do it. The harder part is we don't know how to go to Mars today. We have to do a number of technology growth areas in order to figure out how to even go to someplace like Mars or someplace to go drive capabilities-driven architecture. So if that's the case, then those really are government missions. And so I don't expect us to be going to Mars anytime soon with a commercial capability. Maybe generations from now, we'll be going to Mars after the government has done it or international governments have done it, and we might then do something like turning it over. At the same point, there might be some methods of trying to get propulsion or propellants to Earth orbit to go help these vehicles get enough propulsion or energy in order to go to Mars. Those very well might be commercial. So I think the commercial crew program, as 20 years from now, you look back at it, very well can go create a method by which you can commercialize portions of space, not all of space, but portions that we think industry can go do. So
Yeah, I might have a little bit more freedom to speculate than Ed does. So I won't speak to what NASA is planning to do, but I'll speak to what we as an organization would like NASA to do. I think it is clear with the success of the first two SpaceX launches that the COTS model, which is this development under Space Act agreement with a lot of flexibility and then purchase of services under a regular contract, but a fixed cost contract, has shown some real success. And we are certainly talking to NASA and looking at ideas and ways that we could use that success in the future. Now that's in other arenas. So that said, the areas that I believe are most susceptible to being turned over to private industry are areas where there's a repeatable task. That is because if you're going to do something once or twice, you can't you can compete to find out which company does it, but then you never get to know to really estimate how much it costs, because you never know until you do it how much it costs. And you can't have future competitions. You can't compete out to do it again the next time, because you start to transaction costs overcome any benefit you get from competition. If, in the case of the commercial crew program, at least 2 flights a year are in the end what NASA wants, and over a certain number of years, and so that's enough to have a volume that it makes a lot of sense to commercialize. There are other ideas about transferring fuel or maybe certain kinds of construction or whatever to orbit for future missions. But I think, for the foreseeable future, NASA will, you'll always see NASA at the tip of the sphere, and the commercial industry will be the ones, helping to get them there.
Yes. Yeah, right side. Go ahead.
Right. You know, I just want to say I'm with the Society of Satellite Professionals International. I'll be speaking a little bit later today. And I really just want to say to Alex that you are the executive director of an association that should be friends with my executive director. So if you can just Lysol one of your cards, I'd love to have them.
Yes, I've actually worked. Well, we can talk about it, but yes, I know.
All right, we'd love to thank our panel again for their perspective. And we'll be back shortly in 15 minutes.
Capabilities architecture. Let's build the first piece, make that happen. Then we got to figure out how to make the second piece, and then where we're going to go with that piece. And so that's the capabilities architecture-driven capability. For low Earth orbit, it's all about commercial crew, which is really all about space station. It's all really about space station. Space station is an unbelievable $100 billion laboratory in orbit today that is led by the United States, with a significant partner being Russia and 14 other countries that are participating. It is truly international. And we just spent the last 4 or 5 years putting that space station together, actually since 2000, or 1998, I'm sorry, since 1998. So 12 years of putting it together. And we've had people living on board continuously for more than a decade on board the space station. So you think about what do we do today for space? We are flying to space all the time. And we have humans living on a space station for the last 10 years. Not the same ones, but different ones about every 6 months or so. Those folks need a transportation system to get back and forth. The shuttle was the United States way of doing that. When the shuttle was retired, the next system is the commercial crew system. Otherwise, we have to rely on our partners, the Russians, in order to get our crew to space. In order to go do that, we have to give them money, cash, our tax dollars. So the policy of the United States and the policy of NASA is to go develop a home-based system that is made in America for our American crew and any other crew that wants to fly with us. It is a partnership. It's very different than the way NASA has done business before. So as a commercial crew program manager, not only was my mission to be a program manager from the classic NASA way, but also to do it way different. And that's really what my team is trying to do, is do things way different. The normal NASA way, or the normal government way, if you've worked with DoD, is there's a contract, and the contractor does whatever the customer, in this case NASA, commercial crew program, would want them to do. We tell them exactly how to make it, exactly all the requirements, exactly all.
Right now we'd like to introduce Ed Mango for his keynote. Ed Mango serves as the program manager for the commercial crew program at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The commercial crew program is leading NASA's efforts to develop the United States capability for crew transportation and rescue services to and from the International Space Station and low orbit. The outcome of this capability is expected to stimulate and expand the U.S. space transportation industry. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ed Mango.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, I am Ed Mango. I'm the program manager for the commercial crew program. It's NASA's program that is very much trying to figure out how we're going to get back to low Earth orbit with an American-made system to go do that. So tonight, or this afternoon, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, what we're doing on the NASA side, how we're working closely with our partners, and then after we get through, we're going to have a panel discussion with some of the other folks that are really part of the stakeholder team that's trying to enable the commercial crew effort as a whole nation. So first, you always got to start with a bang, so we're going to do that. specifications, and then they go build it and they charge you a price to go build it. And in the end, NASA owns the system, NASA owns the design, NASA operates the system. The Commercial Crew Program is done differently. We are doing it in a partnership, in which in the end, we don't own the system, we don't own the design. We collaborate on the design and the system. We have, in the end, we want to buy a service. So today, I don't know how many of you flew in here, but you flew in an airline. And that airline is a service. And it's a service contract, really, between you and the airline to get you from point A to point B. What we want to do in the next generation or two is create the same capability for low Earth orbit. We'll start by going to the International Space Station, but over the next 10 to 20 years, we want to have a capability that says anybody can go to low Earth orbit. Most of them do research, because that's what we're doing on Space Station today. It's all really about the research. Research in materials, research in biochemistry. It's all about what you can do in zero gravity or low Earth gravity so that you can bring that capability, bring that knowledge that you gain from space back to Earth, and then go produce medicines, go produce materials that you can use for life here on Earth. The whole space station is all really about life here back on Earth. For the Commercial Crew Program, it's a partnership. And this partnership started back in 2010. And in 2010, we had what was called the Space CCDev1, or Commercial Crew Development Number 1. And that was initial concepts. In those initial concepts, we had a number of companies join NASA in that endeavor. We then transitioned to CCDev2, which is now just finishing up, and it was really maturing designs of a system, that is, of a spacecraft or a launch vehicle. And now we're in what we call CCICAP. NASA loves acronyms, so we have more. The Commercial Crew Integrated Capability. And I purposely put the little I in there, because I get to do that as a program manager, because most of us have iPhones, and most of us have iPads, or a lot of us might have iPads. And it changed the entire way we look at getting on the web. The ways of activities are actually going on, real hardware. None of those were artist renditions or anything like that. That was real hardware from our 3 partners that we're working with under CCICAP. See, the Commercial Crew Program is really leading NASA's effort to develop a U.S. capability that is safe, reliable, and cost-effective to get our astronauts to low Earth orbit, as well as really create a business profile that anybody can get to low Earth orbit using U.S.-made vehicles and U.S.-made systems. And so NASA's helping with that. The whole purpose of this is we don't think industry can do it on their own. Human spaceflight has really been a government program through NASA for the last 50 years. We want to transition that to industry. And part of what we want to do is through this Commercial Crew Program. We have a logo, as you can see from the picture. For those of you that have followed NASA, it looks a whole lot similar to the flight crew emblem that they use. That's because we are going to be flying people. We have red, white, and blue, meaning that it's coming from the United States. If you look closely, the way the flight crew pin is, it's a little different than ours, where if you look at ours closely, it's an orbit. It looks like a C for Commercial Crew. And of course, we have the same star that they do at the top of theirs, which is we're trying to fly crew into low Earth orbit. All right, so what is the Commercial Crew Program in reference to the big picture? Well, NASA really has an exploration picture that it has put together. And I think there's been some other discussions over the last day or two here about other portions of the exploration mission. From our standpoint, the exploration mission is really broken down into 2 pieces. That supports low Earth orbit, and that supports beyond low Earth orbit. And earlier, I think today you saw or you heard some folks talking about how we're building an architecture to go beyond low Earth orbit. And it's really a So if you really thought that the American space program was at a crossroads, it is, but as you can see, all those pictures and all those videos